So good afternoon and good morning or good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to close the workshop on today's workshop on gender inclusive competition policy. Since we could not attend each and every breakout session that were simultaneous, I think we thought to give the floor to the three moderators of each session to give us a very quick overview of the discussions in their session, maybe highlighting in particular some new points that have come up in the discussion that we're not covered in the papers. Maybe Chris, we can start with you on your breakout on market definition. Then maybe we can give the floor to Despina on cartels and collusion, and last but certainly not least to Lynn on prioritization and public interest. So maybe Chris, why don't you take a few minutes to summarize the discussion in your breakout?
Thanks, Antonio. So various different things. I mean, first and foremost, I suppose just to highlight for those of you that haven't read them yet, the two papers that we discussed, the one by Gunnar and Lola from Auxera, Marissa and colleagues, and Johanna and colleagues from Analysis Group, both really focusing on kind of the economic analysis that goes into market definition and competitive effects, and the way that can be done differently with the gender lens. And I think both of them in their different ways certainly demonstrate, you know, the really big difference that we can see this sorts of this approach having to the analysis and to the results of the analysis. So I mean, the illustrative example in the analysis group piece showing, you know, completely different HHIs and illustrative price rises for a merger, depending on whether you took a kind of a gendered approach to the market definition or not. The surveys that Auxera had run through a whole range of different industries in terms of markets, in terms of package holidays, health insurance, banking, sports TV, all of these sort of things where both market definition could be different, the effectiveness of remedies could be different. And even we got at one point onto things like the effect of a cartel on different groups of consumers could be different, and that might be something that the system needed to have a way to deal with. So really useful on that level. One thing that we spent a bit of time talking about was the idea that we put a lot into sort of consumer behavior here, and we sort of say, you know, there are differences in the way that men and women behave as consumers. I think perhaps to me, there's definitely something here in terms of recognizing that there are both differences in preferences between groups that are cropping up in some of these markets, willingness to pay for products and so forth. But then there are also differences in elasticities. And even if you have the same elasticity, it might be that you're liable to divert to a completely different firm in response to a price increase. And so I think kind of getting into that box and sorting through the different types of differences, if you like, would be a useful thing for the toolkit to consider. Specifically on the surveys, we sort of talked through some of the aspects that are important there, and that could be included in you know, the guidance on surveys that exists in some places, and perhaps that is really useful to be developed if it doesn't exist. Things like making sure that the distribution of consumers that you're surveying are representative of the distribution of consumers in the market that you're looking at. So you're making sure you don't just go for the kind of the population as a whole representativeness, but representativeness of the market in question, and obviously asking the gender question in the first place. I think looking at some of the papers we're talking about, you know, good practice that we'd seen in some places, and certainly I think there were good reports about some cases where competition agencies had looked at some of these products where the gender dimension is fairly obvious or fairly straightforward. You have the pink version of something or other. And so there, I think it seemed like there had been more, we'd got further in terms of creating frameworks and sort of lists of what to look through and how to analyze those. whereas the bigger problem was on those where the gender difference might be less obvious from the characteristics of the product, but there might be equally important differences. And then just generally, I think there was a lot of interest and discussion on the point about data and the types of transaction data that could be useful to examine, whether predictive naming databases and so forth would be something that firms are able to use to distinguish between genders, and then also the importance of looking at like marketing plans and the internal documents with a gender lens in mind as well. So yeah, certainly an interesting session worth having a review at later stages if you missed it.
Thank you, Chris. Definitely very interesting discussion. I participated to your breakout, so I can confirm. Despina, would you like to take a few minutes to summarize the discussion in your group?
Yes, thank you, Antonio. It was very interesting. We got lots of questions, and if I had cut it short, and I apologize for even joining 5 minutes later. Basically, what we concluded more or less is that gender imbalance does constitute the risk for cartel practices. In particular, it was fairly conclusive that what one research team calls boys club, i.e. informal networks among men, can create incentives, create trust, so they can create incentives to collude, aversion to deviate below the whistle, and therefore they can lead to both cartel formation and cartel maintenance. Therefore, for competition agencies, they should look at the gender of individuals suspected of cartel practices. They should also look at their relationships to understand the group dynamics, like monitor business connections, possibly look at the gender structure of firms to set investigation priorities. There was a suggestion in the third presentation that maybe informal networks like members clubs or sports clubs or charities could be scrutinized. For those reasons, or maybe some indications that women might be more averse to collusion, increasing the number of women in management position might in fact reduce collusive behavior. And we had this the nice link between cartel busting and quotas of women on boards is that when cartel busting leads to board restructure, presumably we assume that the board is restructured to remove the people that have been personally implicated in the cartel. In countries that have binding gender quotas, obviously the number of women increases. This is telling in two ways: there were not enough women before, and also it provides a link, not at the start of an investigation, not to start cartel enforcement, but between the findings, the outcome of cartel enforcement, and gender policies, basically the use of bounding quotas on boards. There are lots of suggestions for future work. In order not to take up more time, I won't go into this, but all three teams said this is the beginning. We'd like to investigate further, and especially the academics among the group. And the next steps, that would be the toolkit. Some of the findings from the discussion will be used for this.
Thank you, Despina. Lynn, over to you to conclude with the third breakout session.
Thanks, Antonio. And I think, like the other two groups, unfortunately, it ended a bit early and the conversation could have continued for some time. The papers that we discussed were very rich and they had several different elements that unfortunately we never got the time to touch on to. So just for people who haven't read the papers, the first one we dealt with by our three colleagues from South Africa looked at how the South African public interest clauses, historical disadvantaged persons, could be applied within the gender space. What is the learnings that we can take out of this approach to promote gender equity? And then the next paper also we looked at was internal agency prioritization and structure and how this can be used to help promote gender equity as well. So those were the two papers we dealt with, one more holistic and one really down in the trenches in the details. But let me step back, because what was interesting is at the end of the conversation. And at the end of the conversation, as Mapui from South Africa said, her approach does not treat women or gender like we're fragile eggs and we need to be protected, because we are not fragile eggs. What they're saying is that, in fact, it's a systemic issue. So what competition can do is to help rectify a systemic problem and a systemic issue. And this is the historically disadvantaged persons. There's nothing inherently wrong with these peoples. It's the system was acting against it. So therefore, how can competition law and how can the competition space help to rectify these systemic issues? And that was really probably the best foundation to the conversation, best way for me to phrase it. There was agreement, and even though these two papers seem entirely different, there was many points of agreement. One is the importance of ex post evaluation and scoping on the cases, how gender was treated within cases, within merger decisions, what is the staffing, recruitment, budget. So in all cases, the data is necessary. So agencies first have to collect data on their enforcement activities, on their advocacy issues, activities, and also internally on their structure and prioritization. And I think this is a low-hanging fruit for agencies. This is something that they can do right away. The other thing we came to too was the use of remedies, how remedies are in fact a very, very important and powerful tool to consider gender, to look at the distributive effects of a merger. So we thought that we also considered then the importance of remedies. Something we played with that came out of the February workshop and again was repeated here, but in both of the papers as well, is the importance of stakeholder engagement. So one we had talked about is women's groups, educating women's groups about the importance of competition so that they can advocate, and then also bringing in stakeholders into the conversations about remedies as well. But this also applies to Bill's papers internally. And here he pointed on the important role that IOs can play in helping to ensure that agencies remain diverse. And this can be in the collection of statistics, anonymous statistics as well, to show how diversity is doing in agencies. But then also IOs can profile those agencies that are diverse or profile strong women within competition to show the value of having a diverse agency. One of the points of discussion we had was, okay, well, this is fine to discuss gender. It's fine to have champions for gender, but leadership changes within agencies, leaderships change within government. So how do you hardwire the conversation of gender into the day-to-day practice of an agency or into a government? And of course, the examples of historically disadvantaged persons, the examples of Canada were brought up. The GPA Plus is it's really on the pedestal for being a way to hardwire it. But one of the things that Bill said too was this is one of the things that IOs can do by constantly keeping the conversation going. By whether it's the ICN, whether it's the OECD Competition Committee, one is for us to be a role model on diversity, but two, also not to let the conversation slip off of the agenda. So those were some of the things coming into the recommendations. And finally, also to do an examination of the barriers. What are keeping women out of the markets? But women not just as consumers, but women as employees and women as business owners, women of owners of equity, what's keeping them out of the market too. So we have to ensure that we look upon women in these three different ways, not simply as victims of the pink tax, but also as business owners, equity owners, and then also as employees. So it's very important in our conversation of gender and competition, we consider the multiple roles that women play in the market. Thank you, Antonio.
Well, thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Despine and Chris, for these very comprehensive reports. And thank you, of course, for moderating your sessions and for all the work that I know you have done in the past months on this project. Certainly, you have been moderating very rich discussions today, a lot of food for thought. So the question for us really is, where do we go from here? And what are we going to do with the wealth of information, analysis, ideas, and recommendations that come out of the research project, the 7 papers, as well as, of course, from the breakout sessions today. Florane, who opened the workshop today, she mentioned in the opening address that this project has been made possible thanks to the generous support of Canada. So let me thank again the Bureau of Canada for bringing this work to us. Now, as part of our commitment to Canada, we will now review the papers, of course. We'll read them carefully. We'll take stock of the discussions that we had today and similar discussion in other venues. And we'll try to develop a toolkit.
Recording stopped.
Okay. So I'm free to speak now. Okay. And we'll try to develop a toolkit, as I said, that we'll be presenting and discussing with the OECD competition.
Recording in progress.
To get the endorsement also of enforcers of the agencies that sit in the committee. So we hope that the toolkit will provide agencies with guidance on how they may include gender consideration in their daily work. We'll try to make it as useful and practical as possible. Now, throughout the course of this project, we already started to think about the toolkit, of course. We are well aware that the day-to-day work of competition authorities is challenging, especially when they are called, like they are in this case, to stay on the forefront of economic and social developments across societies, and applying a gender perspective on competition enforcement, these complex and difficult challenges, as you've heard in the breakouts today. What we try to do at the OECD is clearly to obviously support agencies and governments to identify and manage these new and emerging challenges and offer them solutions. So we hope that this work will be instrumental in providing some solutions or some tools to authorities. Now, while the research on gender inclusive competition policy may be young, and let me say with a pinch of pride that this work at the OECD has been at the forefront of these young debates, I think efforts to integrate gender equity across society are not new in other policy areas. And our toolkit will try to draw upon lessons learned in other policy fields, corporate governance, anti-corruption, just to mention a few ones, combined, of course, with the research and recommendation from this project. Now, the multidisciplinary nature of the OECD really puts us at a competitive advantage when it comes to bringing together different experiences, and rest assured we will exploit this competitive advantage. So stay tuned, because this is not the end of our work. Now let me give you just a few ideas or examples of the type of recommendation that we could include in the toolkit. And I thank my colleagues who have come up with this idea based on the first read of the papers and the discussion today. So agencies could first of all consider their own recruitment processes and promotion and leadership patterns. Is the staff sufficiently diverse in the agency in the first place? Because of course a more diverse staff has an impact also on how the law is enforced by the teams. Now, agencies could also review budgeting, resource allocation, prioritization rules to determine if there is space for gender considerations in their enforcement and in their work. For example, prioritization and selection of sectors for review could benefit from a more sort of gender lens in the approach to prioritization. On cartels, you've heard it, diversity of boards and management could be taken into account in investigations, as well as a subject of advocacy efforts by competition authorities to inform firms of the risk of closed or exclusionary social networks. You've heard Despina mentioning the discussion in our breakout session about this. Regarding merger reviews and investigations, and considering investigating more broadly gender-based consideration in the early stages of market definition analysis, Chris' breakout was focused on this, and the evaluation of competitive effects. Some agencies have done this. US FTC, European Commission already taken this approach in a number of cases, and others have done as well. And more can be done. Now, related to this point, reconsidering the design and interpretation of consumer surveys to ensure that the resulting data incorporates gender consideration. A lot of discussion in the breakout session I followed, led by Chris, on this issue about designing and interpreting consumer surveys. Finally, we know that competition agencies' efforts will be more effective if the government support gender equity through cross-cutting legislation. Agency may consider to enter into a dialogue with their governments to consider whole of government legislation that mainstreams gender equity across all policy areas. And this is the case of Canada, so which has been sort of strongly supporting this work. Now, let me conclude by thanking, I would say, our unique cohort of researchers for their invaluable contributions to these emerging area of work. I would like to thank Canada again, and Ellen and Nadia in particular, who reviewed meticulously each of the papers, including some very late ones. So thank you to the review committee as well for your time and for your efforts, all your thoughts on the topic. And finally, of course, thank all of you, the participants, for your contribution today, your active engagement in the discussion, despite this less than ideal virtual format. I would really like I think Despina, Lynn, and Chris have mentioned this. This is not the end of our work. It's probably the beginning of a new work stream. So I really would like to encourage each and every one of you to keep the conversation going. Gender equity remains one of the most important challenges of our time. And of course, competition and enforcement, competition policy cannot ignore this challenge. So this is not the end, but at the beginning, I repeat. So each of the 7 research papers provides a wealth of recommendations and idea for future work. So I encourage you to read all the papers, to pick up ideas from each of these papers and carry on the work forward, even when the OECD will not be able to do so, but I'm sure you will be able to do so in your function. So thank you all very much for today's discussions. I wish you all a great end of your day, wherever you are. Please stay safe and healthy. Thanks a lot again, and see you soon. Goodbye.